Good. I'm continuing with the history of the Jews. This is episode 2. In episode 1, I did Abraham, how Abraham came on the scene and said, this God, Jehovah, appeared to me and made a covenant with me. And from then on, the curtain rises and another great man is mentioned in scripture, Moses. After Abraham, we read in the Bible of subsequent people like Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and how some of them ended up in Egypt. You can read that for yourself in the Bible. How they increased in such numbers that it alarmed the ruling Egyptians. Then the curtain rises and the spotlight is again on one man, Moses, the prophet, whom Jews, even as they proclaim his greatness, refuse to enshrine. At the sight of the burning bush, God selects Moses to free the Jews from bondage. At Mount Sinai, God commands Moses to free man through the instrument of the Torah, the Hebrew name given for the 5 books of Moses. We do not need to know about Moses, but he has an impact on all our lives in the Western world. The laws of our land has deep Mosaic imprint. There were laws before the Mosaic laws, the Sumerians, whose written code of laws dates back to 2500 BC, were probably the first people on earth to have a written code, but it lacked the passion for justice of the Mosaic laws. 500 years later, the Sumerian code was augmented and incorporated by the Babylonians into the Code of Hammurabi. But again, this body of laws did not have the democratic spirit of the Torah. The Mosaic Code then was the first truly judicial written code and eclipsed previously known codes with its all-encompassing humanism, its passion for justice, its love for democracy. The Torah was a bold leap into the future. It actually was for a settled community, but at that time they were still nomads wandering around in the Sinai desert. But God envisaged that there would come a time that they would be a settled people, and these laws would be really apt. So albeit at the time of wandering, it was given to them, they knew about it, even though it was not very practicable at that time. In the Mosaic law, the individual can do anything, not specifically denied to them. So instead of saying, do such and such thing, the law of Moses usually say, don't do this or that. So if it does not prohibit it, you may do it. The 10 Commandments, for instance, list only 3 do's and 7 don'ts. So in reading these laws formulated some 3,000 years ago, one is still amazed at its humanism. Some of the areas where it is, even at that, 3,000 years ago, they could think of the fairness, the justice, and that is our God. Really and truly, he cares for the small little people. Somewhere I read there is this huge concern for the poor, huge concern for the orphans and widows, huge concern for sick, for the underclass, really. And here are some of the areas where the Mosaic laws differs from even today's laws, where it is so much more humanistic than even today's laws. For example, slaves. If you read about slavery in the Jewish community, it is very humane and lenient. Slaves were treated humanely and leniently more so than the slaves treated in the United States in the 1850s. Usually slaves are taken from their own people. And every seventh year, on the seventh year, there should be manumission. They are freed. And if they do not want to be free, they may tell their owners and say, I do not want to be free. Then they'll be slaves forever. So it's, when you talk about slaves, we have this image of slavery in the United States, in the Western world. It wasn't like that. It was indentured service in the sense that because you're poor, this is the only job you can have. So you live with this family and do everything at their bidding. So if and they're freed every 7 years. And if they don't want to be free, wow, there are slaves who do not want to be free. Yeah, yes. See, shows you what kind of society it was, even for slaves. And the divorce laws were liberal in the time of Moses too, than even in present day Western and Islamic countries. It's just amazing. And marriage is definitely between a man and a woman, as instructed in Genesis 2:24. Chastity among the unmarried is held in high esteem, unlike today. Prostitutes was looked upon as a degradation, and religious prostitution, so prevalent in pagan days, was viewed with abhorrence. Homosexual relations between men were grave criminal offenses, whereas such relations between women were regarded as scandalous but not criminal. But Paul in Romans 1 added relations between women and women as just as heinous as between men and men. It made God as spirit and forbade images of God, which is revolutionary. Every other nation around them has a God that they can see, a carved image, but the God of Israel is an invisible God. Imagine that, how revolutionary it was at that time. So everyone else among them had gods they could see. So by making God spiritual instead of material, the Jews were free to change the spirituality of God instead of altering his physical appearance. So having a spiritual God rather than gods in stone gave the Jews a feeling of cultural superiority. So the intellectualism of the Jews was a character trait that was caused by making God abstract. Another result was the renunciation of brutality and sadism. So even as the concept of justice based on a written code of law is a Semitic innovation, it was the Mosaic law that departed from the others, whether it is the Code of Hammurabi, the Greek, or the Romans. So I've pointed it out prior to saying this. But something else that is also different is lex talion, the Roman name given for the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a wound for a wound, has all too often been portrayed as a barbarous practice. Far from being barbarous, it was a law of restraint, really. It was man's first step toward modern concepts of justice. In essence, it substituted public law for private vengeance and served to prevent punishment in excess of the crime committed. The offender could not be made to pay for one eye with two. The Torah recognizes no class distinction before the law. When it comes to justice, there is no difference between patrician and plebeian. Some historians argue that biblical accounts from Abraham to Moses were not written until 1,000 years later. In essence, it thinks that this history was an invention If that is so, then the Jews picked a humble past for themselves. If they made it up, they could have, or maybe should have, made it a more nobler ancestry, right? If you were to pick your own family history, if you were to make things up, would you pick a humble one? Or would you pick something that is much more noble, that you're richer and wealthier and more class than you really are? But some people in this political age will fake a dreadful past, like my family was poor, we didn't have, like I'm one of you, whereas they were not. But definitely, even as I look back on my own past, I tell no lies. You know what? I can look at my own past and would have PTSD for how bad it was. But praise to God, all things work for the good to those who love him and who are called by his name. And I can see the hand of God in every single thing. I pray that this has blessed you, even as we struggle in this world to know what to do.